American and Indian officials say they are very close to a trade deal and that the announcement could be made by both the leaders in the next few weeks. If that happens, it could be a huge vote of confidence in Indo-US bilateral trade. But there is, of course, a catch because of India's continued purchase of Russian oil. The United States has imposed a second 25% retaliatory tariff, taking the total to 50%. And despite American pressure, data shows India's Russian oil imports have not really dropped all that much. Meanwhile, in a bid to offset the oil heat from Trump and his officers, New Delhi has signed a major 2.2 million tons annually LPG deal with the United States. Trump had made it clear that he expects India to buy more American energy when both leaders met back in February at the White House. And both sides are now hoping that this new purchase of LPG, the highest ever that India has inked with any foreign country or foreign company, will offset some of the trade tension. We'll break down what is happening in the Indo-US trade relationship on the question of tariffs and whether a trade deal will be announced soon and why that matters both for India and America and what could come next. The United States imposed a 25% reciprocal tariff on Indian goods, citing imbalances in trade. This was among 100 or so countries against whom the Trump administration had imposed what they call reciprocal tariffs to try and correct the trade imbalance. And then he followed that up a month later in August of 2025. Team Donald Trump announced an additional 25% tariff, bringing the total tariffs on India to 50%. Specifically, India was targeted for import of Russian oil. Trump also sanctioned the threat of secondary sanctions on India if it did not curb its Russian oil purchases. He claimed that Prime Minister Modi had told him that India would stop buying Russian oil, but Indian officials deny ever making such a commitment. But Trump insists this is going to happen gradually.
You know, we're making a deal with India, a much different deal than we had in the past. So right now they don't love me, but they'll love us again. We're getting a fair deal, just a fair trade deal. We had pretty unfair trade deals. They're very good negotiators, sir. Just you have to take a look at that, if you would, please. But we're getting close, Scott. I think we're pretty close to doing a deal that's good for everybody, right?
But here's the problem. India has deep energy ties with Russia. As per Kepler data, India's intake of Russian crude remains robust. Oil ship tracking data from October 2025 pegged Indian imports of Russian oil at 1.48 million barrels per day. That's slightly up from 1.44 million barrels per day in the previous month of September. Analysts argue that India's purchases are not dramatically declining. In fact, it may only be increasing. On India's side, the argument is that these imports are driven by long-term contracts. There is an economic logic to them. There's also India's energy security. And it's not just a question of a switch on or a switch off button. In November, India's state-owned oil companies, IOC, BPCL and HPCL, signed a one-year contract to import 2.2 million tons annually of LPG from the US Gulf Coast. This volume is close to 10% of India's total annual LPG imports. The deal is being seen in New Delhi as a way to diversify its LPG supplies and also possibly ease trade frictions with America.
But it's all price sensitive. I mean, if cheaper energy is available, and it's a very complicated game. It's not something that I can sit and determine. There is a cost of production per barrel, international price, which you all monitor in terms of one system or the other system. Then you add to that the cost of insurance, the cost of freight, the dollar exchange rate, and several other things. And then it works out. So I think the good news is that we import from a large number of sources. New suppliers are coming on the market. By the way, I mean, to those of you who are listening to me after a long time, there is more and more energy coming on the global market and more is coming from the Western Hemisphere.
But Indian exporters are feeling the heat. Exports to the US have fallen, as per Commerce Ministry data that's been released this week, 9% in the month of October and 12% in the previous month of September. A rollback of the first 25% tariff could provide some relief to Indian exporters, particularly in labor-intensive sectors like leather, apparel, and gems and jewelry. Buying discounted Russian oil is not just about price, it's also deeply tied to India's energy securities. Refineries are configured for certain Russian-grade crude, and contracts are long-term. The government must balance pressure from America with domestic needs. Of course, in a country like India, any increase in retail fuel price definitely has consequential domestic implications, political implications. Cutting Russian imports too fast could spike energy costs. That is something that no government would want to sit on top of. Similarly, India is also signaling that it's open to trade cooperation with America, but not at the cost of its energy sovereignty. The LPG deal is being used as a counterweight that India is willing to deepen its energy ties with America, but at the same time, India also has legitimate market-driven reasons to source its oil from Russia. So what happens next? Watch out for formal announcements, if any, between the two governments, particularly between the two principals of both governments, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump.
I said whenever the deal is fair, equitable and balanced, you will hear the good news.
Will the 25% reciprocal tariffs come down soon? If a deal is struck, then India could see a boost in its exports, particularly labor-intensive sectors that have been hit by American tariffs. Even if Trump demands further cuts to Russian oil, any reduction may be phased out. US sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, the two biggest Russian oil refiners, may force Indian refiners to rethink which Russian barrels to buy and how much and how they source them, because they too would be open to sanctions that have been imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft. Key to this would be the ship tracking data for the months of November and December to see if volumes actually drop. The preliminary data that we have for the first 15 days of November, Russian imports have only increased slightly, closer to 1.8 million barrels per day from 1.4 million barrels per day the previous month. Russian President Vladimir Putin is expected to be in India in the first week of December. India is unlikely to do anything drastic before such a high-profile visit. The outcome could reshape how energy diplomacy blends with trade. It could also set a template for how emerging economies like India can negotiate with much bigger economies, much bigger powers like America, using energy deals as leverage in the trade negotiations with Trump and Trump's America. The global rules of trade and tariffs are being rewritten even as we speak.
Been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing.